quand on est allé, c'était, comme c'est souvent le cas, on arrive en délégation et puis c'est un bel endroit, tu sais. En tout cas, de prime abord, ça a l'air merveilleux. C'est des îles paradisiaques aux Philippines. C'est de toute beauté. C'est verdant. C'est tropical. Fait que ça, pas de problème. Il y a encore des arbres et tout ça, là, tu sais. À l'arrivée, on arrive par bateau parce que Marinduque, c'est une île. Les Philippines, tu sais, c'est une archipel de 7000 îles, n'est-ce pas? À la sortie du bateau, déjà sur le quai, il y a des grandes pancartes puis qui disaient Mark Hopper, vous souhaitez la bienvenue, nous soignons l'environnement, en tout cas, on veille sur l'environnement, les réparations, quelque chose comme ça, tu sais. Donc, tout de suite en arrivant, on est accueilli par cette image que ils sont bien tristes de cet accident qui est arrivé là, puis c'est leur département de l'environnement qui travaille fort là-dessus pour tout arranger, pour régler des affaires, tu sais. On arrive là pour le désastre, puis c'est eux autres qui font la publicité sur comment ils sont bons. Dans la mission d'observation, il y avait Ted, il y avait moi, il y avait Catherine Coumans, et puis on était quand même une 6-10 personnes.
Our goal was to see what was the destruction caused by the dam spill. So we visited the actual site itself, the mining company. We went to the village. So we stayed for about a week, I think. And we went to, the other communities. We interviewed the townspeople. And we saw with our own eyes the devastation of the mining.
Les familles qui étaient encore là, qui vivaient sur l'eau, puis dont la subsistance a été enlevée parce qu'ils ne peuvent plus pêcher. Ils n'ont pas le choix, ils sont pauvres, et puis donc ils mangent encore le poisson dans cette zone contaminée. Là. Puis on a vu des enfants là, qui avaient encore des maladies de la peau, là, la psoriasis et tout ça, là, eczéma, tout ça. Et puis, ils ont parlé des effets qui sont encore ressentis par la population locale.
They were really mad at the company. In fact, when they found out that we were from Canada, they told us to bring the toxic spill back to Canada with us. That's how mad they were with Placer Dome. But the engineers were telling us that there was nothing wrong with the spill, that the waters were still clean. They claimed that they paid the villagers some compensation. They were only paid at the time we were there, equivalent to about 10,000 pesos. I don't know, $1,000, Canadian dollars at the time. So it was not enough.
Et puis, on a été visiter ce bassin de déversement. Puis, tu sais, à vue d'œil, ça a l'air beau. Wow, c'est vert, c'est verdâtre, ça a l'air de... En tout cas, c'est beau, là, tu sais.
This might look pretty, but the reason why this water is so green is that's because copper in the rocks are being absorbed, and the water has an extremely high copper content. There's another mined out pit. You see this really, really, really green color. That's from the copper precipitated. And you see how some of these rocks here have a bit of an orange color? That's acid mine drainage. What happened on Marinduque was the island was basically ruined by an accident.
There was a Canadian mining company called Placer Development Limited. It now was later called Placer Dome, that became interested in an ore body on this very tiny island of Marinduque back in the 50s. So Placer Development Limited became Placer Dome. They got access to the ore body. What people did not understand is that a large time that they were mining, because they started mining around 1969. And in 1972, of course, President Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines became a dictator, that he had been the partner, 50% partner in that mine with our Canadian mining company, Placer Dome.
There wasn't any environmental protection. There was no transparency in the contract. Our dictator was a part of that operation, and basically you had a mining operation that was not following any regulation, that was not subjected to monitoring, and that was basically benefiting only a few very powerful individuals.
And this is a very small island, about 200,000 population at the time, mainly reliant on fisheries and farming, and highly reliant on its natural water supply, so its rivers, because people use the rivers for food, they use the rivers for transportation, they use the rivers to have their animals drink from the rivers. So the rivers were critically important. In the course of those 30 years, one large bay, shallow bay that was filled with tailings, with mine waste. About 200 million tons of tailings, covered about 80 square kilometers of the bottom of this bay. The next disaster was in 1993, and they wanted to start another mine. And in order to dump what they call the overburden, they found another little creek, but that creek was the head, it was called the Magilla-Gilla Creek, but it was the head of the Mogpog River, which is a really major river in Marinduque. And they dammed that creek, and they decided to dump all that overburden, what they call overburden, into that creek. And by 1993, it already burst. And all the waste that was contained behind that dam flooded down the Magilla-Gilla Creek into the Mogpog River and all the way down the Mogpog River to the sea. Completely flooded out villages along the shores of the Mogpog River. This is very mountainous, so it was going downstream, and then completely inundated the town of Mogpog. 2 children died. They were swept away by the mud that was behind the dam. And it was a huge disaster. And the Mogpog River to this day has never been rehabilitated. The river is, for all intents and purposes, dead. And then 3 years later, in 1996, the next disaster, the second mine had started. They decided at a last minute to dump their mine tailings from the new mine into the old pit. And there was a drainage tunnel at the bottom of that pit that led to the Buak River, another major river in Marinduque. And they just put some cement in that drainage tunnel and thought, that'll hold, that'll be fine. And the plug burst. And all the waste that was contained in the old pit, the first pit, the mine tailings, all flowed through the tunnel and into the Buak River and inundated the 26-kilometer long Buak River from the mountains all the way down to the sea, and the tailings went out into the sea. Again, villages were flooded, rice fields were flooded, the river was completely contaminated, it was just filled with tailings, looked like one big cement river. And again, that river has also never been rehabilitated and is still affected to this day. The people of Kalankan Bay did file, they had actually 2 legal actions against this dumping. And the first time they actually won. They won their case, and the authorities told Placer Dome to stop dumping tailings into the bay and to come up with an alternative. And of course, because Marcos was the secret partner, Marcos directly overturned the court order to stop the dumping in the bay by the Office of the President. And in 1988, they again tried to get the environmental authorities to agree that this dumping was causing harm and that it should stop. And so in 1988, we had Corazon Aquino was now the president of the Philippines, and the people went to her environmental authorities, and they did a review, and they said, yes, this is absolutely causing egregious harm. This should not be happening. They told the company, you can continue dumping for now, but you have to come up with an alternative solution. And instead, the company closed the mine down and turned off the electricity to the whole island and put a huge amount of pressure on the Corazon Aquino government. And of course, it was a new government and it was very weak in those days. And so in the end, again, this order was overturned directly by the Office of the President. the dumping was allowed to continue, but they had to spend some money on trying to actually cover this huge wide causeway of tailings, which were blowing all over the place, blowing into people's villages, blowing into people's wells, into their rice fields, into their houses. They used to call it their snow from Canada.
So this is what happens when mining companies are allowed to exploit the development of the country. So for me, as a former Filipino citizen, I'd rather have the Philippines not developed by any mining company, any oil company, if this is, you know, the result. I'd rather have the resources in the Philippines intact with no mining corporations, because we have lived for centuries without mining corporations. Why should we be allowing these mining corporations to come to the Philippines and kill our lands?
So basically, due to the resilience of people from Marinduque, fisheries and agriculture in the river and in the bay is difficult now. It's almost not feasible to do agriculture in the Boac River and Calancan Bay. But what has driven the economic recovery of Marinduque is butterfly production. They have reforestation projects, and their main products right now are coffee and cacao. I would like to end with a personal story, if you don't mind. Story of what happened between me and my 2-year-old son. I remember I I read to him every night, and his favorite book was titled The Last Tree. To cut the long story short, the book was about two children helping the forest animals to save the last tree from logging and mining. And on the last page of that book was the whole forest, children, the animals, and the last tree was celebrating. And part of the celebration was the fireflies. Thousands of fireflies lit up the last tree standing in the forest. And so we've been reading that, his favorite book, every night for more than almost 2 years. And then when he was 4 years old, suddenly one night, after finishing that story, he suddenly asked me, "Dad, by the way, what's a firefly?" And it struck me. 2 years we've been reading his favorite book. He hasn't seen a firefly. And I made myself a promise that night. I will not let my son grow up without seeing and enjoying fireflies. And that has been my motivation. And I hope that the next generation and your generation will have more trees and more fireflies to keep your life more meaningful.
Después de que el jefe de seguridad de la compañía minera, Alberto Rotondo Dalorzo, ordenara disparar en contra de varios comunitarios que se encontraban protestando frente al proyecto minero, exigiendo el derecho a la consulta. Y en esa oportunidad pues se escucha muy bien en los audios como el jefe de seguridad, las escuchas telefónicas y otros audios que se tienen ahí, se escucha como el jefe de seguridad de la compañía dice: maten a esos perros, y se dirige a ellos con una serie de palabras soeces